Charles, and I'm one of the Deputy Directors at the UK Commission for Employment Skills. So I'll be sort of chairing things today and trying to keep to time and so on. I'm delighted to see you're here, and this is the first in series of the Commission's Masterclasses. Rather confusingly, it's actually the second, but we had to postpone the first because of tube strikes and so on. But I think leaflets have been sent out sort of saying what the intended series is, and there's about 6 in the series, and I'll sort of mop up and say a bit more about that at the end. But essentially, I thought I'd start off with 1 or 2 words of introduction about what the series is about, and then actually focus on the purpose of the session today and formally introduce our speaker, Francis Green. So I'm not going to say very much by way of introduction. I also don't know if I'm meant to, I'm just thinking about things, whether I'm meant to say anything about fire and emergencies, but I haven't heard anything. So I assume that there won't be any kind of practice, so if anything like that happens, we'll just sort of follow the fire exit signs. But in terms then of introduction, why have we felt the need to set up this masterclass? And essentially it's because, well, certainly from the UK Commission's perspective, we are in the space of trying to work with government and key players involved in the skills system to make the skills system as effective as it can be. Part of that, I think, is about making sure that in this information-rich age, we have the best intelligence, really, about how we can improve the system and where we need to target interventions and reforms. And in its way, this masterclass series is trying to contribute to that. Using rather old-fashioned techniques, getting people together and talking about issues, and in particular, hearing from leading experts and thinkers in the field, such as Francis, we thought it would be a really important thing to do. And really make sure that, I think another pressure of the current world is the endless pace for change and reinvention and innovation, and we need to really make sure therefore that we are taking stock of how we got here in terms of the system and experiences and learn lessons from that. So it's trying to make its contribution in that kind of space. So that's sort of a general introduction why we're here. Another component, perhaps just quickly to say by way of introduction, is that the Commission is running these master classes in partnership with the Institute of Education, and in particular LLAKES Research Centre, which I'm going to have to look this up, Francis, because I can never remember what it stands for. Centre for Learning and Life Chances in Knowledge Economies and Societies. So this is a centre at one of our leading research and teaching institutions, leading in the world, which has received money from one of our research councils, the Economic and Social Research Council, to actually do further applied research and thinking in this whole area about effective skills systems. So in that sense, I think we thought it would be a really valuable thing to do, to actually use the expertise of the experts that are working in that centre. So we've put our heads together and we've come up with a short series of masterclasses, which, if you like, in the best sort of methods of social science, are a pilot of the events, and it'd be really valuable in that sense to get your feedback about how it's gone today, to learn from that in terms of running some of our forthcoming events. So that's really all I was going to say by way of general introduction. I've got, to preserve time, I don't intend to go around and find out who everybody is, but I've got a list of potentially the people thought that we would have here today. And we've got representatives from DWP, from BIS, from DEFRA. So I don't know if all those people are still represented in the room. We're assuming that we're touching policymakers as well as analysts. So we'll try to take that into consideration in some of the things that we talk about. So that's general introduction. Are there any questions at this point? Quite obvious. Okay, so what we're going to do then is now focus on the session for today. It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Francis Green, who, as you already have deduced, is currently working at the LLAKES Research Centre at the Institute of Education, and has been working in this area for some considerable time. Started from a physics background, Francis, when I was looking at your biography here. Studied physics at Oxford University, and then moved into the field of economics at the London School of Economics, where he did a thesis, and has worked in a variety of academic institutions before actually moving to his current position. So we're delighted that he's here. He's going to be talking today about this question around the demand for skills. So at the heart of any skills system, if we're wanting people to take skills provision, which is going to hopefully equip them with skills to get on in their lives, to get into the labour market and progress through the labour market, at the core of this really is making sure that we really understand skills demands. So this is a particularly pertinent question, and at the heart of really what we're all working to do. So with those words of introduction, Francis, I'll hand over to you. I don't know if I said, but I'll say it again if I did, just to reinforce it. Francis is going to go through the whole presentation, and then we'll take discussion and questions at the end, if that's okay.
Thank you very much indeed, Leslie, for that introduction, and welcome to everybody. Yes, as Leslie said, I've got a number of slides to get through, but if there's any obvious points of clarification you want to interrupt to, I'll certainly deal with them. Just a word or two about LLAKES for people who are not familiar. It's, as Leslie correctly said, it's a centre to learning and life chances, and this focuses on the knowledge economy. And the real essence of it is, it's not just that it uses a lot of nice words, is that it's trying to be an interdisciplinary approach to looking at all the questions that we're interested in. I mean, I'm assuming we're all interested in skills, we wouldn't be here. But it's trying to make an interdisciplinary look at it. I'm an economist, many of my colleagues in LLAKES are sociologists, some are psychologists as well. So we come at it from a number of different angles, and we try to look at some of the fundamental conflicts between the need for economic competitiveness on the one hand, the need for social cohesion on the other. Those are the sorts of visions which motivate the centre. And we work with the basis of a core of 3 or 4 researchers and lots of regular academics like me who sort of dip in and dip out. I mean, I'm much more on the research field. Some of my colleagues are spending a lot of their time just doing ordinary teaching. So that's how LLAKES works, and it also works in conjunction with the National Institute for Economic and Social Research and Southampton University, so it's kind of linked outside. So much about LLAKES, as Leslie said, we've collaborated with the Commission to put together the series. So this is the first one, and the position of this lecture is best described by this diagram. I'm not going to, if only with this complicated diagram, you will find it in, you'll find a leaflet on his chair, which is for this book, I'm going to actually be talking about some of the concepts in chapter 5 of the book, which is about the demand for skills. That's really what I'm basing the talk today on. But I wanted to locate what I'm going to say in context. And I think this is very important because the word demand for skills is very often confused in public discourse. And there's a confusion between the demand and supply in what I call the market for skill formation services, such as training and learning. You know, I buy a course from a course in a further education college or something like that, or from some other training provider, which is what's going on in the top half of this diagram here. And in the bottom half of the diagram is the demand and supply for skilled labour. It's a labour market. Okay? And what this talk is about is actually this, the demand for skilled labour. these are the employers which I'm going to argue as a really key agent in the way our economy and the skills system work. And they're demanding labour from skilled workers who provide it, and there is a deployment of skilled work, and that's what goes into production. So it's the activity on the bottom half that I'm going to be talking today, and that's really all I need to talk about. So in reality, the whole skills system is an articulation of those two markets. Okay, but sometimes when the phrase the demand for skilled or demand for skilled labour, it's confused with the demand for training, which is more a dynamic thing over time. Right. So with that clarification, why is the demand for skills important? Well, I think it's fairly obvious. I'll just rattle off 4 reasons why it's important to have a good understanding of why of the factors behind the employer's demand for skills. First of all, they affect the prosperity and the availability of good jobs. Highly skilled jobs tend to be better jobs. Secondly, the amount of skilled labour that employers want obviously underpins their demand for training services and their provision of training services. So this is the point about the interlocking of those two markets which I mentioned. Thirdly, we often use evidence about the demand for skills to underpin our educational policies. We say things like, the skills are rapidly changing in this modern world. You hear phrases like that. Well, is that so? What's the evidence for it? So we need to understand, where is the evidence that skills may be changing? And the fourth reason I think it's important is that we see in the demand for skills a reflection of the strategies and attitudes of the employers in any particular economy, or in particular in Britain. And it tells us something. The whole story is interrelated with an understanding of where employers are in this country. So I think there's many reasons why we should be looking at the demand for skills. And here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to give you, first of all, the conventional understanding that if you had a conventional economist up front of you, he or she would be talking about the conventional model, but I'm not a conventional person. I might look it, but I'm not. And I'm going to introduce an alternative model which is actually drawn from some managerial theory called the resource-based view of the firm, and consider the implications that has for the demand for skills. And that leads on to something about why employers matter and in what way employers matter. And then we look at some evidence on the rise in skills demand, see how Britain is in the international context, and then have a little glimpse into the future. So that's the plan. There's quite a lot I'm trying to cover, so I won't, I'm not going to spend lots of detail on every single point, but be more than happy to come back and go into particular areas. So first of all, there's a conventional model which is premised on this assumption of a broadly competitive labour market, where if someone's getting more wages than another, if skilled labour is getting more wages than lower skilled labour, it's because they're more productive at the margin. An extra worker is able to produce extra value, or more extra value, than a low skilled person. Okay. That's the essence of the conventional model. And if there were any economists, they would in the room. I'm sure there are some who have done economics in their training, but they will recognise the following point, which is that really it's saying nothing more than that firms maximise their profits. They will employ more skilled labourers, the skilled labour, up to the point where their wages match to their marginal product, the extra product. And that's saying something about, yes, they decide on how much skilled labour to demand based on profit maximising objective. Well, of course, that's a fairly simple, even if it's the basic one, it's a fairly simple view of the world. We know that all labour markets aren't perfectly competitive. It's not like by buying and selling apples and bananas in a street market, when we sell our labour, it's usually not just for today, but hopefully we get a long-term job, maybe lasting for decades. There are lots of complications, if you like, things like, well, skilled labour is complementary with the amount of the kind of capital we have. We know that as you introduce new technology, very often it actually increases the demand for skilled workers to work with it. Not necessarily, but very often in practice. Then there are things like sort of an implicit deals with employers and their employees that as long as you stay with us and work hard, your wages will go up over time. Because they like their workers to stay, they don't like to have a high turnover. And you have things like that. I'm not going to go into every single bullet point there, but I will mention the last one, which is the distinction that's sometimes made, and I'm not going to dwell on it for any length of time today, between different kinds of skills. We know that some skills make you more productive in general. So if you become skilled with working with, say, Excel spreadsheet, you could go work for another organisation and be valuable to them. But there are other skills which maybe aren't of any use to any other firms, just makes you more productive in the firm you are. So that's the way that the conventional model goes. Let's not dwell on that any further. What is the policy implication of the conventional model for demand for skills? Well, the policy implication is that employers, if they're profit maximising, they take optimal decisions from the point of view of their own firm. And we should not intervene with them. They know the technology environment, they know the economic environment. What's government got to do with that? What's civil servants got to do with that? Might as well go home. It's nothing our business what employers do in there. Well, actually it's not completely true within the conventional model, because of course there are market imperfections. In particular, there are many cases where what happens for one person or one employer actually affects the rest of the industry or the rest of society. A classic case would be maybe some firms train up their workers, those workers then go and work for other firms, and then maybe at least part of that extra value they give to other firms, the rest of society. And as soon as you get an externality where the private benefits are not quite the same as the social benefits, then there's a case for some kind of social agency to intervene. It doesn't need to be national government, it could be regional government, it could be an employers' organisation, something to impose either a levy or some regulation, something to affect the decisions that private agencies make. All that can be taken care of within a conventional model. So there is plenty of argument for governments to intervene and find the best way of intervening to make things better from the point of view of society. Now, the resource-based view of the firm, which is my alternative, is drawn not from an economics perspective, but from a management perspective. And what the management theorists do is they ask themselves the question, this has been going on for the last 20 years now, they ask themselves the question, what do firms do in order to achieve sustainable competitiveness? They ask the question about, if you find some new technology and you introduce it, if it's very easy for someone else to copy that technology or just introduce it themselves, whether it's in this country or abroad, then I'm only going to be able to make some profits on it for a short period of time, because we're in a very competitive globalized world. We can't sustain that competitiveness. But instead, firms look for ways of innovating which they think other firms won't be able to imitate, at least for a long period of time. And this is the that's the idea which underpins this resource-based view. And they ask, well, what resources are there in the firm in order to create these hard to imitate and hard to substitute innovations. And one of the key resources is human capital, is skill. And even though you could say, well, okay, there's that firm over there, it's employing a more educated workforce and doing well, I'll do the same. Obviously, I'll learn from that, I'll do the same. Actually, it's not as simple as that, because the way that skills help firms to become more productive is quite complex and often opaque. Often the way that one thing causes another is ambiguous. The management writers talk about skills being attached to idiosyncratic customer relationships, if you can deal with that rather complicated phrase. I think I know what it means, but it means that each firm has its own kind of relationships with different customers, and the more skilled workers are able to work those to their advantage. Building on that, there's the dynamic capability models which stress the role of managerial capacities in dealing with these innovations. Okay. So this whole notion of, well, maybe managerial capacity makes a difference was completely absent from the conventional model. The idea that somehow some managers can be more capable than others, because in the conventional model everyone was assuming to be doing the best, all at the most efficient level, if you like, at the frontiers of what was possible. In a managerial approach, that's not the assumption, and we assume that there are variable management strategies. Some sets of managers go for long-term strategies, other more for short-termist strategies, and so on. And very often it would be very difficult to change the strategy of a firm because it's embedded in the history of the firm. So that, for example, if you're producing a brand, and this brand is associated with kind of very simple products without complicated features to it, which are easy to produce and basically trying to compete through lowest cost, then it would be quite a long haul to suddenly say, oh, well, I'm going to go upmarket, high product spec. How could you do that? Because your whole workforce is geared towards the lower product spec end. So what this means is that management culture and management strategy is really important. And this is why we come to the proposition that employers matter. Employers' capacities matter. They have what we can call agency. They're not just responding to some kind of profit maximizing rule, which actually any computer could do. They're actually imbued with a culture. They have a certain level of capacity, which can change, maybe over time, and that makes a difference. And as soon as you then say that, you have not only the usual reasons to why government agencies might want to intervene or try to influence matters for skills, but you also have an argument for engagement of social agencies, whether it's groups of employers or government or regional government, engagement with employers to increase their learning of the benefits of training, the benefits of upgrading their skills and so on. So that's really why I wanted to contrast the two models, and it's worth thinking more about it, is because it's only with an alternative model like resource-based view of the firm that you can actually get a better justification at the higher level for what a lot of government actually does, not only in this country and in a lot of other countries, and certainly some of the policies which the Commission has been putting its weight behind over the last 5 years or so. Okay, so moving on rapidly, we can come back to that topic whenever, if you like. What about this story that there is rising demand for skills over time. Is it true that we live in an era of rising demand for skills? Some people might think that's obvious. Why am I going to belabor it and spend time? Other people might, especially if they've read sociological literature from back in the 1970s and 80s, be very sceptical. They would say, well, is it really more, are workers really doing more skilled jobs, more complex jobs nowadays, or actually have they become more simple and more controlled by the bosses or something like that? Well, there are actually 3 sets of studies which suggest that on balance, overall, there is a rising demand for skill. It's not to say that there aren't some areas where you could say skill has gone down. For example, think of a teller in a shop. You can perfectly easily sit in the teller and say Sainsbury's and take the orders, etc. Press the right buttons without being able to be very good at arithmetic and adding a total of the groceries. But overall, on average, the studies are pretty clear. So there are 3 kinds. First of all, there's the direct studies, and I'm going to show you one example of a batch of evidence. These are based on the skills and employment surveys, which I have been personally directly involved in running since 1997, but they've actually, for some variables, go back as far as 1986. And this is just one table amongst many, and it gives you, amongst all the people in employment, a picture of the jobs where a degree level or equivalent qualification would be required, and the jobs where no qualifications are required. And you see it's pretty unambiguous trend over time that nowadays more than a quarter of jobs you have to have something like a degree level in order to get it, and actually also to do it. By the same token, back in the 1980s, nearly 35% or so of jobs you could get without any qualification whatsoever. You could walk up and go into a job in principle. Nowadays it's down to about 23% of jobs. You have at least something, at least a level 1 qualification. Okay. So you might say, well, qualifications aren't skills, but there are other indicators. For example, this is tracking from 1997 onwards the use of certain skills in the workplace. This is numerical skills, boom, 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 steadily up, nothing dramatic there. Essential computer skills, well, they jumped a lot in the late 1990s from there to there, but they're still heading on up. This is professional communication skills, which were heading on up, and then they seem to have stabilised the last 6 years, between 2006 and 2012. Professional communication skills is what I'm trying to do at the moment with you. It's, for example, it's like giving speeches and presentations, influencing people, instructing and so on. But they've been getting more important jobs. These are proportions of all jobs in all of Britain, not including Northern Ireland, in other words. So, yes, there's other direct evidence of increasing use of skills of various kinds.
The data on the problem-solving skills is a bit interesting.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's not my best.
Why is it dropping?
Well, it's a particular thing of the essential problem-solving skills, but it may be that we don't measure problem-solving skills best. And in the OECD PX survey, we do it better.
And that shows a different trend.
It hopefully will do, but we don't know the trend yet from the OECD data, because it's only just been done last year. But you're right to point that out. Not all skills are going upwards according to that. So that's direct studies. Then there's another way of doing it. This is, I put my economics hat on and say, well, how do we know that skills demand has increased? Well, it's 2 facts tell us this. First of all, we know that the supply of skilled labour has increased a lot. This isn't about the supply of skilled labour, this talk, but actually one of the biggest changes comparing Britain in the 1980s from now is that there's a much more educated workforce, much more educated. All about social change, education is perhaps the biggest of them all. So we're a much more educated workforce, but the return to being educated, for example, the return to getting a degree level qualification is as high now as it was then. So if you think of simple supply and demand, the supply has gone up, the price hasn't changed. If anything's gone up, it's certainly not gone down. It must be the case that the demand has gone up an equal amount. So sometimes economists view the world as a kind of competitive race between the supply of skills over a century or more and the demand for skills. So the mere fact that the returns to getting a degree haven't changed, at least possibly until recently, and the number of graduates in the workforce has gone up, is in itself evidence of rising demand for skill. The third thing is to look at occupational structure, and here's an interesting thing to look at. This is a backcast and a forecast of skills actually in the European Union, this particular diagram. And I put it up because if you do it these big categories, higher skilled, skilled non-manual, skilled manual, etc., you get a fairly steady picture of increasing at the high skilled level the proportion of jobs which are classified into occupations, so like more and more professional occupations, more and more people in management jobs, and so on and so forth. And taken over the whole of Europe, you can see it's like a slow but steady change over the decades. This, of course, was actual. This is forecast, and I'm going to come back to how they forecast them before the end of the talk. But there's a nuance to that story of upgrading the occupations over time, which is that if you look at it across the whole spectrum, from the most skilled level to the least skilled level, and then ask how employment is changing, you find that, and this is particularly for the period 1995 to 2008, but it's even more dramatic if you take an earlier period in the 70s and 80s, you find that the 80s and 90s, you find that the upper end, yes, those jobs are increasing. This is like the sort of most of the decile at the top of the skills range, yes. Those jobs have increased by nearly 6% over this period of 13 years. The ones at the bottom end nibbled up a little bit, not much change. It's the ones in the middle that have gone down. Okay, so this is
what source is that?
that's from the Labour Force Survey. Not my diagram, but I think I took it from something which is in the Labour Force Survey. I just put that one up as more up to date than often I show and other people show the diagram from the 80s and 90s. But there's some evidence that some kind of polarisation, as it's called, is still going on. So over some period you actually find an increase in the least skilled level. And what's going on there is that maybe there's increased numbers of caring jobs and so on, which are certainly the least paid, and not the least skilled. So then we ask the question, why is demand for skills being rising? And there's a number of candidates put forward. I'm just going to check the time, so keep my time, yes, I better get move on. The rising supply of skilled labour. I'm going to skip that slide, so I'll say basically what I mean there. Some people say, well, actually the supply can lead the demand, that get more and more educated people, that will make more skilled labour cheaper, and in the long run that will lead to increased demand. Yeah, but in the long run is the phrase there. It's really could be a really long run effect. It's not really a serious candidate for being a driver of the actual changes that are taking place. So the ones I want to look at a bit more are global competition, particularly technological change, management practices. I should probably take another 5 minutes or so, shall I?
Yeah.
Given what we're doing. So, technological change, it's argued by both sociologists and economists that there are forces in the major technology in the modern era, which is computing, which are essentially skill biased. And this phrase SBTC, skill biased technological change, particularly because it's assumed that new investment which brings in the new technology, is basically demanding of more skilled rather than less skilled labour. And what is the evidence for that? Well, if you look across countries, you find it's the same old industries, therefore the same technologies, where the skilled labour content is going up the most, and it tends to be those industries which are most introducing R&D, most introducing computing and so on. So there's solid empirical evidence to support the link with technology and say that's where the skills demands have increased over the last, let's say, 30 years or so. And then there's that nuanced theory, or that nuanced result that I showed you just a moment ago, whereby the idea that maybe in the middle is where the jobs were going down, and the bottom end jobs were staying the same, or if anything going up a little bit, and the top end were going up. The argument advanced there is that it's something to do with the programmability of tasks, and that there used to be many jobs in the middle ranking where people were middle paid, if you like, and the middle ranks of the pay distribution, where they happen to have the jobs which are most easily displaced by technology. I'm thinking of bank tellers, those people in the back rooms, the financial system, and many other industries where, frankly, you don't see them nowadays because the computer's doing it. It's quite interesting sometimes when you see old films and you see in offices, row upon row upon row of desks of clerks, relatively educated for their time, pushing bits of paper around and signing things off. All those jobs are gone. And many of them went in the 1990s in Britain. And so that's the argument as to maybe why there's that kind of polarised shape. Say that about technological change. I'm going to skip forward with the time, just a couple of slides missing. I can always come back to other slides if you like, or you find it in the book. I want to say something special about Britain in terms of the demand for skills. And the answer is introduced on this slide. Often you'll find in discussions talk about the problems with the supply of skills in Britain. I'm going to a seminar tomorrow in Biz looking at the PIAC data, which identified the problem of low skills amongst young people in Britain. Fine. What I think the problem for Britain is not only a question of relatively low skill supplies compared to some other competitor nations, but also relatively low demand relative to at least some comparator economies. Not to lots of economies, but some of the key economies like Germany, France, Sweden, Norway, America, that we might want to compare ourselves with. What's the evidence for that? There is a patchwork of evidence which tends to support this. I'm going to show you a couple of diagrams, both drawn from the OECD survey of adult skills, which came out last year. This is a diagram giving the people in the proportions of people in either low skilled or low qualification requirement jobs such as primary education or less, and then at the opposite end tertiary education or more. And I want you to look at this bar here, which is the proportion of people in jobs which according to the SAS are in jobs for which you wouldn't really need much education to get them. Okay? You see the figure there is about 23%, pretty close to what we had in the earlier survey. low-skilled jobs, it's still, even though it's coming down, it's still about 23% that we get without having any qualification. And you see that it's actually higher than most of the other countries.
Why has Germany got none?
Well, because you can't
They're
get,
all skilled.
according to that, you can't get any jobs. That's an interesting observation. I've not noticed that. Yeah. It can be to do with the way that the education system is classified across countries using the UKCES system. So that may be the answer why there's absolutely none at all. But Germany does do better at the lower end and has more demands at the lower end. So that's one observation which I think is quite telling, really, when you just compare other countries. It's not enough on its own, it's just not like that. And there is obviously a relationship with that, is that if you now compare with the actual level of education that people have, and look at the incidence of overqualification, which is where people have a qualification at a level and they're in a job which they wouldn't need that level of qualification. So we can look at the proportion, how it varies across countries in a consistent way. It's the first time we've been able to do this. And there's England and Northern Ireland at the bottom of the rankings here, or if you like at the top of the rankings in terms of the proportions. You'd always expect some people to be mismatched. You shouldn't expect these to be zeros. Nobody's got a system which is perfectly matching people with their jobs. But we seem to be worse matched in this country. We seem to have fewer jobs demanding these qualifications than there are supplied. So I think that's an issue. That's an issue. Just glimpsing into the future, the slides which you can take away with you, and I'll take another couple of minutes if I may. Is that all right?
Yeah.
I'm going to draw a distinction between an optimistic scenario, which for these various reasons suggests that maybe skills demand is going to go on increasing. I've showed you the slide suggesting it's been increasing steadily, more or less up until now, the last 20 years. There's this whole school of thought which is optimistic, which will continue to increase, continue to support increased prosperity, and therefore continue to support the case for education and training in the economy. But there is another scenario which says that many managers in Britain persist with their kind of low skill strategy, low product specs, low skill strategy, and that industrial demand will shift to low-skilled service industries. Well, there is now also a little industry amongst analysts like myself who go about trying to do skills demand forecasting, and which the Commission's made use of, and European a Centre for Study of Education and Training based in Greece has done the same thing, and you get forecasts of the future demand for occupations. So you may, in your travels, come across something like this, where economists and others have brought together models to forecast the future demand for people in different levels of occupations. This is across Europe, but you see the equivalents in the UK. I want to just make one observation, which is always worth doing. This is one column here which says this is the change between 2010 and 2020 that's expected. And you'll see all those numbers are relatively small, the overall change in employment. Yeah? But this is what's called the replacement demand, because of course people are retiring. And so it's just because things aren't changing overall, it doesn't mean to say that there aren't openings for new people coming in. So that's the main observation to make of that. Then you can then discuss, well, where are the new openings coming? And of course you see, well, if you want to advise a young person, you'd say, probably not much thing in skilled agricultural and fishery workers. Or maybe you knew that already, but that's the sort of...
I think things are changing there. Sorry, I'm from Devon. But
Okay, all right. So that's the sort of thing which comes out there. But of course, we shouldn't believe these models necessarily, and there are other people who really say things about on the demand side, and I'm going to give you a couple of pictures to finish up with, because there are other people around who say that we haven't really seen anything yet in terms of technological substitution. They say that the robots are on their way. It's not just these easily programmed tasks in jobs. Here's a cow. Maybe you see that on the farms in Devon. Here's the cow being milked by the robot. Here's an orchestra being conducted by a robot. Here's a robot making taste. And here's a rather distractive smart machine. So these robots maybe and smart machines are being touted as destroying jobs in the future. There's the next slide. I won't read it out to you, but you can take it and read it on the way home. It's full of quotes from esteemed people like Bill Gates saying that labour demand for lots of skill sets will be substantially lower. To my mind, you have to take all these rather pessimistic or apocalyptic forecasts with a pinch of salt. Some of these things obviously are already happening. A lot of things, though, are just people speculating about the future. And we know that when people speculate about the future, particularly for technological change, 9 times out of 10 they get it wrong, and particularly with employment. And I'll finish with the observation from an occasion in the 1990s where a big fuss was made about how computers and technology generally was going to finish the demand for work almost altogether. And there was a big book published called The End of Work, the question mark on it, but basically the argument was work was ending and we wouldn't be any jobs for most people. And it was very big in public discourse in the United States and a bit in Britain. I think it was in 1994, 95, something like that. And yet, it was completely ungrounded, in fact. It was at a time when employment globally and within the United States was on as big an upward trend as it had been for a long time. It was to me, it's inconceivable the separation between this kind of forecast and the facts of what were going on. Employment was expanding, and yet somehow doom and gloom was being predicted. And within a couple of years, it disappeared, that whole book, but the whole debate went on in complete absence of empirical reality. Well, I'm not going to accuse Bill Gates of complete absence of empirical reality, but all I can say is it's really very difficult to forecast what's going to happen in 10 years' time to employment. And that's enough, I think, for me to say. And I'm happy to answer any questions on any part of that. I'm conscious I've tried to cover quite a lot of ground, and I haven't covered everything in my slides. They're there for you to peruse at your will. And some of the arguments are extended and hopefully explained a bit better in the book.
Okay, well that's been really, really valuable. Thank you very much, Francis. And since you were plugging one of your books, I probably plug a piece of research at the Commission, which we've done, which is on the future of work in this kind of more qualitative way of thinking about it as well. There are kind of limits with these quantitative models, but that's another important dimension coming at that issue. So that's on our website if you want to read that and haven't seen it already. So we haven't got a huge amount of time because I'm conscious that we're running until about 1. That's right, so that's what we've said. So we don't really want to delay you, because another added value of the masterclass is that you could just slot it into your lunch hour and in between other meetings, so we don't really want to overrun. Whilst you're thinking about questions, I thought I'd sort of ask the first obvious one from my point of view, Francis, is in terms of you were sort of emphasising the value of taking approach to some of this that comes from a variety of different disciplines. And at the heart of what you were saying is different models. Does this mean there's a lot of debate and falling out of arguments over some of this, or what should we take from that?
I'm an evangelist for interdisciplinarianism, such a word. But unfortunately, academic life is quite compartmentalised in general. So there isn't enough debate, I would say. I would say that the managerial theorists argue away about the resource-based view of the firm, but it doesn't affect the way economists think, and vice versa, enough. So it's a criticism really of my own profession, but I find it in other disciplines that often people are inward looking, and it's only when people get out to the real world, people like civil servants that have to deal with policies which can't, almost by definition, be single discipline. You realise that models on the single subject models really break down a lot of the time.
Okay, so throwing it out to others. Any questions for instance?
I had one about how do you, so when you look at some of the graphs, sometimes the differences look quite large, but at other times they're quite small, like when you did it across the whole European Union. And I was thinking, how do you sort of communicate how confident you are in the findings? So I was thinking school league tables is a lot about, how certain are we about these, and I'm guessing when you're sort of making projections and stuff like that, it's, it's a challenge, I guess, maybe not a fair question.
It's a really good point. I think what's underlying what you say is that very often people put up graphs which show changes which might not even be statistically significant. I have a personal view on that. It's never worth talking about something which isn't statistical. Why waste time saying which change is not significant? Well, I've got plenty of other things to say. So I personally only say things which are statistically significant. But in terms of bringing your point across to whatever audience you're talking to, there's not always the scope for sort of being very meticulous and stating the scientific background to it. So I think it's a matter of good practice, isn't it, really? And not to cheat and try and show something which isn't really there. I think this is where academics can contribute by producing good quality stuff which hopefully gets peer reviewed. That's all I can say. But personally, my view is I think it's only worth talking about things which are substantive and make a difference. And so it's not worth saying, well, something's 54% instead of 53%, and then jumping up and down and saying it's really important. It might be an indication of something changing over years, but I'm much more likely to find me jumping up and down if it's like 60% instead of 50%. You know what I mean?
Right. Shall we take a few together?
Four.
Are you happy to do that?
Yeah.
Together, and then not answer the ones you don't like.
Well, that's another way of choosing.
Okay. Are you ready? Right, so can you say, I should have said this earlier, people say their names, so we can all sort of at least get to know each other a bit. So,
Karen Booth, Office for Life Sciences in BIS. My question is as following. You've got the graph Occupational Change in Britain 1995 to 2008, which shows the dip in, I suppose, the mid-level type skills. However, in the life science sectors, that's pharmaceuticals and medtech, and more widely, what we are seeing is employers stating that there is an increased demand for high-level vocational type qualifications. And so my question really is, now it could be there is a lot of demand from employers which is just not being met, but there does seem to be, or it could be skills systems currently not providing that type of qualification, which appears to be the case. But I'd be interested in your views on one level there's evidence seeming to suggest those mid-level jobs perhaps falling away. On the other level, looking at life sciences sectors specifically, there does seem to be demand for high-level technical jobs which is not being met.
okay.
Cathy Williams, Beers in Vocational Education. A piece on looking at the future of work has just landed on my lap, so this is good timing. But my question is, it's more of a kind of cultural question perhaps. Is there something that we think about UK employers that they're much more, we talked about them being focused on low skills and not necessarily always valuing those higher skills when it actually comes into employing people? Is that something that we think might change, or do we think that might be something that's more intrinsic to UK employers in the way that they think about their staff? But equally, are we then likely to also see in the future more people with those skills who are underemployed moving abroad? Are we likely to see more and more migration as people decide to take advantage of globalisation? And also on a personal level, should I encourage my son to learn German? Instead of thinking about specific technical skills.
Let's take one more.
Rose McNamee from the Automotive Communities. I wondered if you, I'm not an economist, so you have different models to me, I'm sure I don't know some subtleties of them, but assuming that somewhere in there there's the truth of how things work. What implications do you think there are for the way that government should interact with employers when it comes to skills? I spent time this morning talking to a car company whose argument is basically, we'd like to do something, you need to pay for it. Yeah. And my argument is often, we invest in skills because they have social benefits and we're not going to necessarily just pay you to train your staff. I would speak question, but do you have any thoughts on the sorts of conversations that government ought to be having with employers, sort of implied by either of the two models that you described?
Are there any questions related to those areas that people just want to kind of embellish a bit more? Aoife.
I'm Aoife from the UK Commission. My question's related to the first one, and it's about the polarisation of the labour market. There's been quite a lot of debate about the extent to which that's really happening, if you look at job titles or wage levels and so on, and I was wondering what your view on that was.
Adding on to Rose's question, I'm from a different sector team in Biz. How do you get employers, are the bigger employers better at investing in skills than smaller ones? Because our sector moans that we haven't got enough big primes to kind of invest for the benefit of other people.
Okay. So first, thinking about the polarisation one, it's really a statement about the economy as a whole. So I bet you if you looked at just the life sciences sector, you wouldn't see a polarisation. Well, I don't know actually. You may not see a polarisation there. So I think it's quite possible. What you state about there's an increasing demand for vocational, intermediate kind of skills, I think is extremely plausible. I didn't know that fact. I've learned that fact today. I recently wrote a paper with Jeff Mason from the National Institute for Economic and Social Research about what skill system would be appropriate, what training system would be appropriate for a really expanded industrial strategy, if that ever were to happen. And one of the things we pushed is a balanced expansion of vocational and higher level skills, tertiary skills, both with an emphasis on more interaction between the classroom and the workplace, and the process of learning, which is what apprenticeships are by definition. So, in short, I don't think it's a statement about the overall economy and the kinds of industries and the occupations that are expanding. I hope that answers that bit. But then, where do I stand on whether there is still polarisation or not? I stand a bit confused about the particular evidence on any particular period, and I know that you're right, that you can choose periods where you can't see polarisation, choose periods where you can. Is it still going on? I can't say exactly. And the past is not necessarily a guide to the future here. There is an argument that since it's technology, it must be happening everywhere. We look across European countries, there should be polarisation in every country. The best evidence that I know suggests that's not happening. There are some countries where you see polarisation over a period, others where you don't. The European Foundation for Living and Working Conditions in the Employment Observatory there has done some good work on that in many different countries. So what it suggests is that actually technology, which is the story I told, is not the only part of the story. Other things that happen, institutional differences between countries and within countries make a difference. So, yeah, maybe it's still happening, maybe it isn't. And I'm personally of the view that I think that debate's almost exhausted itself in a way. I mean, obviously we want to be able to get good forecasts for future employment demand. How's it changing recently? Whether it's polarised or not, we still want to know what's the future employment demand. So I see it as a subset of that bigger question. Yes. Then the second question was your question about can the low skills culture be changed? What I'd like to say there, to response to you, and also I think in response to the third question, is I think it's very easy to talk about management in Britain as if it's all the same, but actually it's very heterogeneous. There are much bigger differences within countries than there are between countries. So there are many really good firms in this country, really good employers who train their workers well and employ high levels of skills, match best anywhere. But there's, in the studies, international studies of management skills, which I didn't mention, but there are, they suggest there's rather a long tail in Britain. Okay, there are quite a lot of countries which relatively lay down on in terms of managerial capacity. That's the evidence as far as we know. So the name of the game, if you like, in terms of changing it, is not really to attempt to change the ones at the top end, but to change the ones that are in this long tail, who want to be changed. Obviously, it's not a process of imposition from the outside, but there are, so I'm told, there are many employers there who would like to be helped to learn to ways to upskill themselves, to move up market. Maybe don't have much time to think about it. A lot of those firms are hard pushed to think long-term strategy. And so this then actually dovetails in my response to you when I said, how would you talk to the car company? I mean, I suspect the car company is trying to get money out of the company for stuff that it would be doing anyway, because it's a large company, and presumably. If I was to be asked about more involvement, it would be regional agencies, employers, organisations, when they talk to companies, trying to identify, because they talk to companies all the time over lots of issues, but trying to identify those ones which can benefit from engagement with the Commission and with change agencies, basically. So it's not an easy solution to things, but I do think it's important not to think of employers en bloc. So I'm kind of partly, I think I'm sort of partly answering the third question. Bigger employers tend to be better. Yes, they are. They do tend to be better. Arguably, they're right when they say, well, we know as much as you do, talking to the government, about what we should be doing, and maybe the government agencies can learn from the employers, the good employers. It's ways of finding ways to transfer the good practice from the better employers from the not so good employers.
Okay, I'm going to step in there, Francis. I don't know if you've got all the questions answered in that regard, but I know we're slightly overrun, and so we're going to do that. So, I just think this illustrates, this has been a really fabulous topic and seminar, and I could ask lots more questions. I've got hundreds written down, which I've never had the opportunity to ask, but so clearly perhaps fertile for further discussion in this area. But I just wanted to take this opportunity to thank you very much for running this session today, to thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules to attend. I hope that you found it valuable.